24 debate over the weekend. The head of Hezbollah in Lebanon basically saying that it was a, quote, new phase for his movement with the open acknowledgement of his forces' intervention inside of Syria. With us to talk about it, France 24's Lucy Fielder, who just filed a report where she traveled to both sides of the border with Hezbollah fighters. She is back in Beirut at this point. Also with us, former U.S. State Department official William Jordan, who at one point was posted to Damascus. Joining us from Hamburg, Stefan Rossini of the German Institute of Global and Area Studies, and reporting on that meeting of Syria's opposition, which is taking place in Istanbul, is France 24 correspondent Jasper Mortimer. Before the break, we were talking about how there was a bit of a disconnect between what was being said outside the country and what was being felt inside. Lucy Fielder, I've got to tell you, here in the France 24 newsroom, the debate is open over how much of a spillover effect there's going to be in Lebanon. Those who say that, well, they lived through civil war, they're going to know how to keep a lid on it, how to contain it. But after being to Tripoli, after visiting the Bekaa Valley in the south, are you as sure as those people who say that?
I think if you'd asked me a week or so ago, I would have said almost certainly. I mean, it's very difficult to predict anything in Lebanon. No one expected the 2006 war with Israel. There are many events over the last few years that really no one predicted, and everyone pretends that they did it afterwards. So I would be very hesitant to make a prediction, but I have to say the involvement, or the more open involvement of Hezbollah in Al-Qusayr does take the bets off in a way. And Tripoli, again, is a sign of this. I've reported on Tripoli for several years where these clashes that have occurred between the Sunnis and the Alawites have been often very brutal, often very deadly, but have come to an end after a few days. These have now gone on for a week. As I said before, heavier weapons being used, the death toll now topping 30, and a sense from the people we spoke to, gunmen that we spoke to, also other sources, residents in Tripoli, that the politicians here no longer have control of this. And for many years they did. They used these fighters, if you like. They used the situation, the impoverished situation in some of these Tripoli areas to score points against each other. And there was always a sense that Tripoli was like a pressure cooker. You just let off steam for a while, make your point felt, and then you rein in your men. The fighters this time are making it quite clear they're not going to allow that to happen. They feel that they have actually been used. They feel they've got their goals set higher now. They've got international backing. They feel that the game is changing in the region, and they feel that they've actually, although they may be relatively few on the ground, they feel that they've got the power. And we're seeing this very emboldened Salafi presence here in Lebanon. I mean, some of these fighters will just hop on a motorbike and drive out of their areas and just drive around with guns out in the street. That might not sound surprising, but in fact, for many years in Lebanon, after the civil war, you didn't really see gunmen driving around. That's a very new thing, this emboldened sense. Now, people really aren't sure where this is going to go. There is a sense that Lebanon is like a sort of tectonic plates and it floats around, but at the same time, it rarely erupts, and that the country has found a sort of balance, that there's no real will among the politicians for civil war. What's not clear anymore is that apart from Hezbollah, which has a great deal of control and a great deal of support also in some areas, the other politicians don't really have control, and it's not at all clear that they any longer are steering this ship. I'd still say we're not heading for civil war, but it certainly does feel very vulnerable at the moment and very shaky.
William Jordan, first of all, do you agree with what Lucy said?
Overall, yes, I do. I mean, there are a lot of things that she's raised, and in fact, I could go on and add to that would require us to have a completely separate show just about Lebanon. But I mean, I think it's very important to remember that the currently nominated prime minister still has not been able to consolidate his hold on power. There's a question about whether or not parliamentary elections are going to take place. There's a lot at stake that's playing out just in a sort of political nature that underscores just how fragile Lebanon is. Then you have this sort of violence. Hezbollah and other factions have always proven to be wild cards. Anything can happen, and even though the focus right now is on the northern part of Lebanon and Tripoli, I would not rule out, as we saw with these rockets that were fired against Hezbollah targets in the last 24 hours, I would not rule out at all that you're going to see some sort of attack, some sort of spontaneous violence occurring in Beirut intended to shake the very core of the Lebanese political structure.
And coming from whom?
Almost anybody, but I wouldn't rule out, because they've been fingered for having done so in the past, Hezbollah. I mean, in a way, Hezbollah now needs to respond to these rocket attacks. But as Lucy said, there are people who are appearing, a few years ago, Sunnis were pretty well squashed by the superior forces of Hezbollah. But there are these Salafist groups that are increasingly reasserting themselves.
So everybody feeling emboldened. Stefan Rossini, we've called the show Hezbollah's Gamble. Is it a gamble, or did Hassan Nasrallah really not have a choice, seeing as Iran is his big benefactor?
I think the big problem which we are facing now in the last days and weeks is that the conflict is more and more getting a fight of determination. And all the participants are more and more portraying the fighting as an end fighting, and taking the position, or from the position of Hezbollah, they are in a very defensive position now, because with the regime in Syria, they would lose their connection to Iran. It would be much more difficult to have supply lines from Iran. They are facing now a rise of Sunni fundamentalist groups who are very much opposing Shia Islam out of religious groups. It's not about democracy, it's about religion. And third, they are faced by Israel, which is still keeping it open if they want to attack Iran, if they want to attack Hezbollah. The war of 2006, in a way, did not find a real victor. And so I think they are very much under pressure now, and in a way facing three fronts at the same time, which may be a very big challenge for them.
But did Nasrallah have to go public with his involvement inside of Syria? That's my question.
Well, let's say Hezbollah was criticized already the last months that they were involved in the civil war of Syria, and so in a way, it's a kind of openness that now he's openly declaring this. And I think the city of Qusair, we also have to mention this, is a strategically very important city, because there are two axes crossing the city. The one axis is the connection between Damascus and the coastline. On the coastline, you have an Alawite majority. In Damascus, you have the government, the Alawite-dominated government. So Qusair is at the connection point between these two. And on the other hand, the Lebanese Salafis or Sunnis who are supporting the rebellion in Syria, for them, Qusair was the connection line from Lebanon to Syria. So there are these two lines which are meeting in Qusair, and therefore it's a very strategic position. And
hence the fact that it's a flashpoint. So we have, on the one hand, Hezbollah's involvement, trying to tip the scales. Another element trying to tip the scales more and more. And we can show you the front page of a French newspaper of record, Le Monde, reporting from the rebel side in Syria, and talking about two journalists from that newspaper reporting that they've witnessed gas attacks. One of them, photojournalist, actually feeling quite ill for a couple of days. And it certainly, at least what they saw and what they felt, they say, was certainly a lot more potent than tear gas.
What we have seen basically is people suffocating, shocking literally, people spilling blood, fainting, and having to be taken out of this place to the makeshift hospital they have more or less organized in this region.
William Jordan, are we overplaying or downplaying the use of chemical weapons? Obviously, as to what exactly was used and what they witnessed, we don't have firm results yet, but what are your thoughts on that?
Well, exactly that point that we don't know what these chemicals are. I mean, I think for a long time, as these various reports on the chemical weapon use have come out of Syria, a number of experts have disagreed as to whether or not it necessarily points to chemical nerve agents that the Syrians are known to have in their stockpiles. or strongly believed to have in their stockpiles, versus some other sort of riot control type gases, CS gas as well as tear gas, in terms of the effects, because in high concentrations, many of these gases can be quite lethal, but they produce different effects. So we really don't know. I mean, I think the Le Monde report is alarming, but again, the problem is we haven't been able to get international investigators from the UN or any other body in to actually and credibly come up with the evidence to prove one way or the other what kind of agents are being used and how.
All right, the French foreign minister telling reporters in Brussels where they've been meeting to try to convince their EU partners, France and Britain, to lift EU sanctions, saying there's increasingly strong evidence of localized use of chemical weapons. The French foreign minister speaking again as the French and the British try to convince their EU counterparts to ease those sanctions and or lift the embargo on weapons for Syria's rebels.
It is preferable for an EU policy to be able to continue. But for that, we have to have sufficient agreement on the basis of that policy. We've tried on all previous occasions on this to make sure that there's still an EU, a common EU policy. But of course, if we can't have one in the future, then each country will have to ensure it has its own sanctions, or the sanctions regime will have to be reconstructed for the future. But let me emphasize, we're looking for common ground in this meeting. Of course, it is preferable to keep that policy together if we can.
Ooh, the EU, a lot of disagreement inside of the EU over whether or not to lift that embargo. One argument in favor, and a lead editorial from the Financial Times this Monday saying that the embargo effectively undermines the Free Syrian Army's moderate leader Selim Idris. For some time now, much weaponry from Qatar and Saudi Arabia has flowed into the hands of militant forces in Syria, including jihadists, without General Idris having any control over who gets what. Jasper Mortimer, Lucy Fielder was describing how the moderate elements in Lebanon are sometimes getting outflanked. At that meeting in Istanbul, do you also get the sense that the moderates are getting outflanked?
I think you're referring to the political machinations that have been going on here over the coalition's decision to expand its membership. And this has provoked tremendous resistance among the existing power blocs within the coalition, notably the Muslim Brothers and a Qatari-backed bloc led by Mustafa Sarga. Last night, or in the early hours of this morning, they took a vote on whether to admit a secular bloc led by a highly respected Syrian writer, Michel Kilo, who's also happens to be a Christian, and whereas Kilo's faction had initially been offered about 20 seats, it was finally offered, and well, it finally won 6 seats. And this dismayed Kilo, and he indicated that he might withdraw. And negotiations have been continuing this afternoon to see if they can't increase the Kilo faction's standing in the coalition, and also to try and increase the number of women. Of the 63 members of the coalition at the moment, only 3 are women. Another 3 women were appointed last night. In that vote at 3 o'clock in the morning, but they're trying to get more women in.
So do you get a sense, Jasper, that in other words, both inside and outside of Syria, the moderates are getting outflanked by the hardliners?
Certainly, that is a fair conclusion to draw from the politics within the Syrian National Coalition. It's said that about 60% of the coalition is secular and 40% is Islamic. But that 40% certainly seems to have a controlling veto on what goes on.
William Jordan, the West right now being very careful about sending more weapons to the to that region. There are precedents, as you know, of arming places like Iraq. And the question, some people are even openly saying that Barack Obama has shown a brave move in the fact that he hasn't stepped in.
Well, I think the most important past precedent to look at is Afghanistan, when the Mujahideen were fighting against the Soviets. I mean, the West poured weapons in, and we saw how easily weapons got into almost anybody's hands as a result of that. I think. Do
you take the Financial Times' point that having an embargo only weakens the moderates, that the hardliners in any case?
No, but I think it weakens the opposition side in terms of the civil war that's raging. I mean, we've sort of talked about this earlier. I mean, I think that the dynamic is extremely fluid. I mean, 6 months or so ago, we were beginning to write off the regime and beginning to think that it was stressed and that its military forces couldn't sustain being attacked on all fronts at the same time. Now we're seeing that, in isolated areas, and I stress it, Al-Qusayr is one battle. I mean, it's an important battle, but it's one battle in a large country. We're seeing that there's a perception that maybe the regime has got the upper hand for the moment. I mean, this is going to be very fluid, and I think that the West has to come to grips with the fact that the only way the situation is going to change fundamentally is by bringing the regime down, and that's probably going to require a military solution. And with all respect to the diplomatic efforts that have to be made to bring everybody together in Geneva, that's probably not going to be the track that is going to change things fundamentally in Syria.
Very briefly, Lucy Fielder, you said how it's hard to predict the future in Lebanon, but do you have the feeling that there is this pendulum swing right now in favor of Bashar al-Assad?
It seems to be the case, excuse me, for the moment, but I'm not sure that long-term the regime can hold on the way it is. That the world forces and regional forces are arraigned against it. And I think that is the reason for Hezbollah's involvement. I think it really feels an existential threat to the axis that it had carefully constructed in the region, or that it and Iran and Syria had carefully constructed. Hamas broke away. That was obviously a pro-Syrian or a regime-supported Palestinian group. It's now joined the other axis, backed by Qatar. Hezbollah sees maybe the regime as being next. If it topples, then the being mainly a pro-Western, US-backed, and in its view, pro-Israeli axis in the area. So that's what it's trying desperately to prevent. So I think for the moment, yes, there is a swing back. But I don't know how long the regime can keep going in the face of the number of forces that are arraigned against it. At
the current time. Lucy Fielder, I want to thank you for joining us from Beirut. I want to thank Jasper Mortimer, who's covering that opposition meeting in Istanbul. Stefan Rossini of the German Institute of Global and Area Studies for being with us from Hamburg. William Jordan, thank you for being with us. Thank you for joining us here in the France 24 debate.